But if I was to select this toggle, what you'll see is that workflow will run. It will update the state that is stored on the actual page itself. And then all of those conditions will be met once the custom state has been updated. So you can now see that we're viewing our application in dark mode. Hello, my name is Lachlan Kirkwood, and today I'll be teaching you the ins and outs of using custom states within Bubble's no-code platform. If you're new to custom states, the best way to interpret them is by understanding that they're a way to temporarily store data within a page or an element in your application. This can be quite helpful if you'd like to change the behavior of some elements or store data without having to actually make changes to your database. And in today's video, I'm going to be walking you through 3 of the most common use cases for leveraging custom states. One will be to create a dark mode switch in an application, so it gives users the ability to turn on or off dark mode. The next is the ability to create a navigation experience using tabs. So we'll be showing and hiding groups based on the tab that a user would like to open. And then finally, we'll be creating a way to temporarily store data on a page before we add that into our database. And between all 3 use cases, they're going to give you a great understanding of how you can start to leverage custom states within your own Bubble application. Let's open up a Bubble editor, and I can start walking you through the process in as much detail as possible. The first use case that I wanted to show you for custom states today is creating a feature that enables users to toggle on and off dark mode within an application. And this one's quite popular because most applications these days offer some sort of dark mode experience. And I know it's something that a lot of bubblers are pretty eager to replicate themselves. And so for the sake of our demo here, I've just created a static home page within my own Bubble editor. And one thing I would just like to point out is that I've installed a toggle plugin, which you'll be able to see under my input forms here. I've installed the free Better Toggle plugin. And this will just enable us to create a toggle experience to enable or disable dark mode. One thing I would just like to note is that I have set the value of this to be no by default, just because I don't want my dark mode to be set as soon as the page is loaded. But after we've added in the toggle, I want to get down to the core of this tutorial, and that is how we're going to create a custom state that enables us to actually create the dark mode experience. And so because the purpose of custom states is to not store data within the actual database itself, we're going to need to set the state on an element within our Bubble editor. And the element in this case is going to be the actual page itself. So if I select my white background here and just open up my element inspector, I've just called this page dark mode for the sake of my tutorial today. And this is where I'll be storing my custom state, so on the page level. One thing I would just like to note is that you can actually store a custom state on whatever element you would like. So for instance, I've got a menu here, which is just a group element. I could store a custom state there. I could store it on any text element or even an image if I would like. I'd personally recommend though trying to keep custom states on one particular element just so you can keep track of where they are. Or if not all on the actual page itself, I'd recommend adding them into groups where elements sit that rely on that custom state. And I remember the first time I ever had to create a custom state in Bubble, the most confusing thing I had to get my head around was where on earth were custom states stored. So if you've ever opened up the workflow editor, you'll know that you can set custom states within a workflow. But in my opinion, the easiest way to create a custom state is by selecting the element itself that you would like to set the state on. So again, this is just going to be my dark mode page as a whole. And then if you just hover over to this information icon here in our element inspector and choose to open that, you'll see an option now to add a custom state onto this specific element. And in this case, I'm going to choose to create a custom state. And what you'll find is that the process of creating a custom state is much the same as creating a data field within your database. So you'll need to give it a name. In this case, I'm going to be calling my state dark mode. And then you'll need to give your state a type. So similar to a data field, this is the type of data that you would like to store within your state. So let's say, for example, you wanted to store some text or some images temporarily on your page. You could select those as the state type. In my case though, I want my state type to be a yes or no option, because I want my page to be in dark mode or to not be in dark mode. So I'm going to select that this is a yes or no value, and I'll be showing you later on in another example how we can choose different state types and also choose the multiple entries option. But for now, I'm just going to set this dark mode state as yes or no. I'm going to choose to create that. And then I'm going to set the default value of my state to now be no. Because in this case, I don't want my page to automatically be set in dark mode. I only want it to be changed when a user actually toggles the toggle element across. And that is actually the process of creating a custom state. So we can now choose to reference this wherever we would like throughout our application, and even start to create workflows that can use this custom state at any given time as well. So I'm just going to close my information column here, and then I'm going to also close my element inspector, because what I'd like to do now is create a workflow that responds to this toggle element every single time it's toggled on or off. And of course, when it's toggled on, I'm going to want to change the dark mode state of my page to be yes. And then when it's toggled off, I'll be turning it back to no. So I'm going to head over to my workflow editor here. I'm going to choose to trigger an event from our element triggers. And I'll be selecting when the better toggle value is changed. And when the value is changed, what I'd like to do is set the state of my page. So I'm going to scroll on down to the element actions menu here and choose the set state option. And now you'll find that you have the option to choose from which element you'd like to set the state within. And now if you remember, our custom state has been added to the page as a whole. So I'll be selecting from the dark mode element, which was of course my whole page. And now from the custom state menu, I'll just choose the dark mode state that I had previously added. And this of course was a yes or no state. So I'm now going to set the value of this to be yes, which means it's going to now update the page state to be set into dark mode. One thing I would just like to note though is that I'm going to need to add a condition on my workflow trigger here, because I'd only like this workflow to run when the current dark mode state is set to no. So I'm going to add a condition here that only allows this to run when the page as a whole, so my dark mode page, when the dark mode custom state that I've added, when its value is currently no, this workflow will now run. And just to help me keep track of what this workflow is, I'm going to update the color of this to be green, because within this workflow we are in fact updating the dark mode state. And then what I'm going to need to do from here is just create another workflow that just allows us to turn the dark mode state off. And so I'm going to choose to once again create a new workflow, and the trigger will recognize when the better toggle's value is changed. And in this case, I only want this workflow to run when the toggle is switched across to yes, meaning we are actively viewing the platform within dark mode. So I'm going to create a condition and recognize when the dark mode page, when its dark mode state is currently yes, this workflow will now run. And within this workflow, I'm going to once again head down to my element actions option and choose to set the state of an element. The element is of course our dark mode page, and then the custom state I'll be setting is my dark mode state, and I'll now be switching the value of this to be no. And because I'm turning off the custom state, I'm just going to update the color of this workflow to be red, just so I can differentiate between the two. And that's all we'll need to do in terms of actually building out the workflows to set the states. Now what we can do is create an experience that allows our page to respond to the current custom state that's been stored in our page. So as we're currently viewing this page, this is how it's going to look within light mode. But what I'd like to do is update things like the background color as well as the text color once the page is set to dark mode. And so in order to do that, I'm going to start by selecting my page element itself. And now I can create a condition on this page that reflects the value of the custom state that's actually stored on it. So if I head to my conditional tab here, I'll choose to define a new condition, and I'll recognize when our dark mode state is set to yes, in which case I'll be updating the background color of this page. So I'm going to need to scroll on down to the dark mode page itself and recognize when the dark mode state is set to yes. I would like to update the background color of this page, and I just have a dark color that I'd like to paste in here. And what I love about conditions in Bubble is that you can choose to toggle these on and off to just preview what this is actually going to look like when this condition is true. I might even just leave that on now for the time being, just so I can see how the rest of my elements are going to look. But now after I've updated the color of our background, I'm also going to need to update the color of my text. So if I select my main heading here, I'm going to need to once again define a new condition. And I'm going to recognize when the dark mode page, when its dark mode state is set to yes, I'm going to update the color of this text. So if I scroll on down to the font color option, I'm going to make this text white. And of course I can toggle that on or off depending on how I would like to view our preview. And then finally, I'm just going to need to update the color of our body text. But one little hack I'd love to show you is how we can actually save time adding in the very same condition that we've done twice now. If we are to right click on our text element here, we can actually choose to copy the conditional formatting. So we can just copy across the condition that we've added to this element. Then I'm going to select my text here, and I'm going to choose to paste that conditional formatting. And now it's pasted across the very same condition, meaning that when the dark mode status is yes, it is going to update the color of this text. And that is all we'll need to do in terms of creating a dark mode experience with our custom states. Let's quickly jump over to our Bubble preview to take a look at how this functions within a real-world application. So over in my Bubble development environment here, because the default value of our dark mode state was set to no, we're currently viewing the page in, I guess you could say, light mode. But if I was to select this toggle, what you'll see is that workflow will run. It will update the state that is stored on the actual page itself, and then all of those conditions will be met once the custom state has been updated. So you can now see that we're viewing our application in dark mode. And of course, if I would like to turn off dark mode, I can just select my toggle again, and it will just update all of the conditional formatting across each individual element. If I was to jump back into my Bubble editor though, there's another great common use case I'd like to show you when it comes to custom states, and that is how you can use states to build a navigation experience. So I've got a separate page here that I've just called Page Navigation for the sake of our tutorial today. And on this page, I've just created a dummy settings page within an application. And within this page itself, I've allowed a user to access both their profile settings as well as their business settings. And within our first group here, I've called this the user settings group. So this will store information that's relevant to a user's personal account. So this will store things like their name, their address, their age, and their height. And then I've also created a separate group called business settings. And this is going to be used to store information about a business they have saved in an application. So this will be things like their business name, the description of the business, as well as the industry of that business. And now what I'd like to do is create an experience where the business name group can actually sit over the top of our user account settings. And then we'll display only one relevant group at a time to respond to the heading that the user selects. So I'm just going to move our business settings group back down for a moment, because what I'd like to do is create not one, but two custom states on my page that just recognize which particular tab we would like to display within our navigation here. And so if I once again select the page as a whole, so this page is called Page Navigation, I'm going to once again select our information icon and choose to add a custom state. And the first state I'll be creating is going to be called display user settings. So this is going to be used to display the user settings group that I've created. And once again, this state type will be a yes or no option, meaning we're either going to display our user settings group or we're not. I'm going to create that. And then now from here, I'm also going to create another custom state that recognizes when we should or should not display our business settings group. So I'm going to create yet another custom state, and this will be called display business settings. And this, of course, will be a yes or no state type once again. And now before we build out the workflows to actually power this custom state, I'm just going to set the default value of our display user settings here to be yes, because as the page loads, what I'd like to do is actually display the user profile settings group first. And then of course we can update that if a user selects to open up the business settings group. And so what we'll need to do is create two separate workflows here that will just respond to whatever heading is clicked. And of course from there we'll be displaying the relevant group when it's needed. So I'm just going to select my profile settings heading here, and I'm going to choose to start edit a workflow whenever this is clicked. And within this, I'm going to be setting the state of our page. So I'm going to scroll to our element actions and choose to set the state. And the element we'll be setting the state of is our overall page. So I've called that our page navigation. The custom state I would like to set is going to be our display user settings state. And the value of this will need to be yes, meaning I would have turned the user settings group on, and I'll be creating a condition on that group to display it in a moment. But what I'd also need to do is ensure that I turn the display business settings state off. So I'm going to need to set yet another state within this workflow step. The custom state will be on our page navigation element once again. And in this case, I'll be selecting that the display business settings state will need to be no. And this just ensures that only one group is being displayed at once. So whenever we enable a state, we'll just need to make sure we disable the opposing option. And of course, as you might remember, our page by default loads the display user settings to yes by default. And so if a user was to in fact select our profile settings text, this workflow just wouldn't really change the custom states because they're already set to this. But what I'd like to do now is create an opposing workflow that enables us to change the custom state when our business settings is selected. So I'm going to start edit a workflow. Yet again, I'll be choosing to set the state of an element. So under our element actions, I'm going to choose to set the state. The element is of course our page navigation menu, and the state I'll be setting is the display business settings group. And in this case, I want this to be yes. And then of course, I'm going to need to disable my display user settings group. So I'm going to set the custom state of our display user settings to now be no. And now we've created two separate workflows that will enable us to toggle between both the options. The only thing we'll need to do now is create some conditions on these groups to either hide or display them based on which state is active on our page. So for our user settings group, I'm going to unselect that this element is visible on page load, meaning it will be hidden until the state of the user settings is yes. I'm also just going to choose to collapse this element's height when it's hidden. And that just means that any elements that sit below this will just move up accordingly. So that way, if this group isn't being displayed, our business settings group will move up and take its place. And now on our user settings group, I'm just going to need to create a condition so this can behave in a certain way once the state value has been changed. So under our conditional tab here, I'm going to define a new condition. And in this condition, I'm going to recognize when the page navigation, which is our page as a whole, when its display user settings state is in fact yes, what I'd like to do is change the behavior of this element and select that this element is visible and tick that that should be true. And once we've added a condition on our user settings group here, we're going to need to replicate this whole experience on our business settings group. So I'm going to head to our Appearance tab and first of all unselect that this element is visible on page load, meaning that it will be hidden. I'm then also just going to choose to collapse this element's height when it is in fact hidden. And then over on the Conditional tab, I'm just going to recognize when the page navigation, so our page as a whole, when its display business settings state is currently set to yes, I would like to select that this element is visible and tick that that is true. And that's all we'll need to create for our navigation custom state experience. Let's open up our Bubble development environment and take a quick preview at how this all functions. So I've opened up our account settings page, and the first thing you might notice is that our user profile settings group is automatically being displayed. And that is because we set the default value of its custom state to be yes. And because our business settings state is set to no, our group is currently being hidden below it. Of course, if I'd then like to open up our business settings group, I can select our title, and that will first of all hide our user profile settings group and then display our business settings group. And then of course I can toggle back over to the previous option if I would like. And that's actually the whole process of creating a page navigation experience with custom states. Of course, you can use this across as many different tabs as you would like. This in particular is quite useful if you're building a single page application. So if, for instance, you're building a mobile app and you don't want to have to direct people across different pages, you can just choose to hide and display groups and create your own page navigation experience quite easily. The very last custom state example I'd like to show you though is something a little bit more intensive, as it allows us to actually store data temporarily that we will then add into our database. So I'm just going to choose to close our preview here. And then in our application, I have a separate page which allows us to create, let's say, a new project within an application. So if I was using something like Monday.com or Trello and I wanted to create a new team project, this page is where I'll be doing that. And so I have a couple of fields here. I've just got the title of the project, the description of the project. But what I'd like to do is create a way to store the value of team members that should be added to this project. And now the reason why I'm going to have to use a custom state here is because this project at this point does not yet exist until we are to click this create project button and run a workflow to actually create that in our database. And so because it doesn't exist in our database, we can't actually add or subtract users from this project as it does not yet exist. And so the best alternative to this is of course by using custom states. And in this case, what I'd like to do is use a search box element here to search through all of the users in my database. And then when I select that I want to add a particular user to this project, I want to display them within my repeating group here. And now I've set all of the data sources for both these elements to be blank because I want to walk you through these in as much detail as possible. But what I'm going to do is first of all create the state itself where I'll be storing the users that will be displayed in our repeating group here before we can then reference them when we create a new workflow. So I'm going to open up my page as a whole. Now I've just called this page new project. And of course, if I'm setting a custom state, I want to choose the information icon here. And then I'm going to choose to create a new custom state. And I'll be calling the custom state here team members. And now what I'd like to do is store a list of all the team members that should be added to this final project. So for the state type, I would like this to be a list of users. So I'm going to be selecting from my user data type in my database. And I'm going to tick that this is a list with multiple entries because I want to add multiple users to a single project. I will then create that. And now what I'd like to do is update the values that's stored within our custom state every single time the value of our search box is changed. But before I do that, I'm just going to need to configure our search box to search through all the users in our database. So from our dynamic choices, I'm going to search for all of the users, and the field I'll be searching through is their name. And now that will allow me to easily search and be prompted with predictive results based on the names that I search in my database. And so now that I've configured my search box, I can create a workflow whenever the value of this search box is changed. So that just means whenever someone actually selects a user to add to this project. So I'm going to jump into my workflow editor here, and I'm going to create a workflow that's triggered from an element option. And I would like to select that anytime an input's value is changed, I'd like to trigger a workflow. The element in this case will of course be our search box value. And now what I'd like to do within this workflow is set the state of our page. So under our element actions, I'll be choosing to set a custom state. The element I'll be setting the state on is our overall page, so my new project. And the custom state I'll be setting is the list of team members. And what I'd like to do is recognize the team members that have already been added to this custom state, and then add to it another user. So I'm going to first need to identify all of the users set in our current custom state. So I'll select from the new project, the team members custom state, which if you remember is a list of users. And then once I've recognized all of the team members that have currently been added to our project, I'm going to choose to plus an item. So if I scroll right on down, I'll see an option here to plus an item. And the item I'd like to plus needs to be a user, which of course is going to be the user within our search box. So I'll select this search box's value. And now one thing I'd like to point out is just the reason why I had to search through the list of existing team members that have been stored on this page's custom state. That is because if I was just to add in the user who's currently stored in our search box, every single time I add a new user, it's just going to replace the existing user in it with the new person who's being selected. So what I need to do is just recognize all of the team members that have already been added to that custom state, and then I'll be adding an additional item to it. And of course, if you have no team members stored within your custom state, it's just going to add in the very first entry. And so now that I've set my custom state to actually store the users within my page, I can now display these users within a repeating group. So if I head over to my design tab here, I have a blank repeating group here. I'm going to need to set the type of content to be a user because I'd like to display a list of users. And now when it comes to the data source, I want to display the users who are currently stored in our page's custom state. So for the data source, I want this to be the new project, which is my page as a whole. It's team members custom state, which of course was a list of users. And now what I can do is just add in the information I'd like to display of the users once they're added. So in this case, I'm just going to want to display a profile photo and their name. So I'm going to select to add in an image element into my repeating group cell here. I will insert dynamic data, and I'll display the current cell's user, their profile photo, and I'll also just process that with Imgix just so I can resize the dimensions by cropping it. I will then close that, and just for a personal preference, I'm going to set the roundness of this to be 100. And then I'll also just make sure that this image is a square. So I'll set the width of this to be 50 pixels and then the height to be 50 pixels. And for the time being, I could just set a solid border around this so I see where it sits within my repeating group. And then next to the user's profile, I just want to add a text element because this will just display the user's name. So I'm going to insert dynamic data and display the current cell's user, their name. And now that's how we can actually display a list of users who have temporarily been stored to the value of a custom state. But what happens when I want to create my actual project within my database? I of course want to not only add the details of the title and the description of my project, but I want to add all of the team members who are currently stored within my page's custom state, which of course are the users displayed in my repeating group here. So I'm going to choose to start edit a workflow when our create project button is clicked. And within this, I'm going to head to our data tab because we're finally making an entry in our database. And I'll choose to create a new thing. The thing I want to create is a new project. And now I'm just going to need to match all of the data fields in my database with the input fields on my page. So for the title, I want this to be the same value as the input title. For the description, I want this to be the value of my input description field. And now for our users, so the team members who have been added to this project. And now one thing I would just like to note in my database is that under my project, my team members is just stored as a list of users, because that's a list of all the people who are being added to this project. So if I just jump back into my workflow editor, what I'd like to do is add a list of users to all of those team members. And that list of users is going to be all the people stored in my current page's custom state. So I'm going to select from our new project page as a whole, and I'll just be selecting all of the team members that are currently stored within that custom state. And then of course from here, if you wanted, you could create something like a redirect event or even just display an alert message. But for the sake of our tutorial today, I'm just going to leave that blank, because what I would like to do now is just show you a quick preview as to how the custom state functions on this page. Over in the preview of my project here, I'm just going to create a new project. I'm just going to say this is called test project. The description will just be this is a test, because the main thing I'd like to show you is just how the custom state is going to work when we use our search bar here. So I'm just going to search through a user in my database called Eric Johnston. I'm going to choose to add him to this project. And because the value of this search box has been changed, that workflow has successfully ran and it has stored the user in our page's custom state. And of course, because the data source of our repeating group was referencing the custom state in our page, Eric's profile photo and his name is now being displayed within it. And then let's say I'd like to add another user. I have a person called Rachel Smith. I'm going to choose to add her to this project, and she will also now be added into our repeating group, which is of course a reflection of all of the users stored in our custom state. And of course, if I wanted to finally create that project, I could select our button here, that workflow would run, and it would actually create that project in our database. One thing I would just like to point out though, and this is probably the only downside to custom states, is that if I was to refresh the page here, it will also refresh the values of our custom states. So if someone was halfway through creating a new project and they were to refresh the page, all of the team members will not be stored in that custom state. And that's probably the only downside to using custom states, is that you just need to ensure that you store all the information and put it into your database as quickly as possible. Because if a user moves on to another page, they're just going to lose that data that they have stored within it. And just like that, you can start to see how powerful custom states are within Bubble. And once you unlock the ability to use custom states, it truly will change the way you build applications within Bubble. That's all from me today here, but of course if you'd like to watch any other Bubble tutorials, I'd recommend hitting the subscribe button below to catch all of my latest Bubble content that I frequently release on this channel.